You have a draft of a screenplay, but you know it needs some help and you need to revise it. But where do you start? And what does revision consist of anyway? That's what we're getting into today. Let's jump in. Before we talk about where to start with revision, we need to talk about what revision is, what it's not, and a few important terms that you need to understand. So we're going to start with the terms. And we're starting here because just the definition of these will help to explain a bit about revision and what it is and what it isn't. First, we have a polish. Now, a polish is actually one of the last things that you're going to do in the whole process. It involves making sure your grammar is working, that your formatting is consistent, your locations and names are accurate and consistent, and even tweaking some lines of dialogue or action description just to make the read a little smoother. Now, you aren't changing any story beats or character beats or anything like that. You're just making it, pretty. You're giving it a polish. The next term is pass. Now, a pass is when you go through your script for a very specific reason. Now, maybe you want to make sure that the lines for one character are spoken consistently. So you might do a character pass for that character. And maybe you're writing a thriller or a mystery and you want to make sure that you've got all the right clues and reveals in all the right spots. So you do a pass for that. Now, in a pass, you are probably altering lines of dialogue and you might even be tweaking story and character beats, swapping some around, eliminating scenes, things like that, adding beats, moments, all those kinds of things. Essentially, you're working through your script one piece at a time to make sure that everything is working together. So you're kind of taking it in pieces. So this pass is this piece, this pass is this piece, and you can do as many passes or types of passes as you want to do. Our next term is draft. And a draft is a complete version of your story from beginning to end. Now, distinction that you need to make is actually between different drafts of your story. And you can think of drafts as iterations of your story. This draft is different because in the first one, the supporting character helps the protagonist, but in the subsequent draft, we kill off the supporting character on page 40, and the rest of the story is dramatically different. It's a different iteration. It's a different draft. So what happens is you have a draft of your story, and as you begin to rework it, doing various passes on it, you get to a point where you have a new iteration or draft of your story, at which point you would start your pass process over again. Ultimately, you complete passes until your draft is basically intact with no major changes, and you go through all the passes, including the last one, the polish, to get to the literal end, at least until you sell it or someone wants to pay you for it or you get some other notes from a producer or whatever that you need to revise the draft further. And this entire process, all of it, is what is referred to as revision. So what revision is it is a process of working on your script and incrementally improving it to get the story and the storytelling where you want them to be for that particular story. And this is an important element. It is a process, not an event. You do not revise your script one time and then you're done. Revision is a process of passes where you are modifying your story and how you tell that story. Revision is not, however, only tweaking lines of dialogue or grammar, which is what a lot of writers think it is. For some reason they think their first draft is pretty solid, so they just do a polish pass thinking that's a revision. And while technically a polish pass is part of revision, it's not all of it. In fact, it's a really small part of it. So revision is not done once and then you're done. And I'm hoping you're understanding that revision is a process. You don't do one revision. Now, some scripts, they may only require a few revisions. Other scripts may require many revisions, many passes. And if producers get interested, you'll have additional revisions. And revisions don't necessarily make the story better. Sometimes they just make it different. But then you still have to go through additional passes to get your script into shape. And revision is not a checklist of passes. It's not that with every script you do the same order of passes and then you're done. Sometimes you only need a few passes. Other times you need several. And I've had scripts that required multiple passes and multiple drafts. I've also had scripts that required only a couple of drafts and a few passes. So this is a key point. Revisions are script dependent. Each script is its own breathing organism, and different scripts require different touches. This is why at some point you need to start filling your toolbox with tools and learn the craft of screenwriting inside and out. It's not enough to just write scripts. Yes, you learn things by writing. Yes, you start filling your toolbox. But if you aren't spending some dedicated time learning the craft, you're not going to be able to successfully navigate the screenwriting process, and for sure, not going to be able to navigate the process of revision. Okay, we've talked about some terms. We've talked a little about what revision is, what it isn't. But how do you do it? I mean, how do you approach your script to revise it? Before I get into this, I need to point out that revision isn't a checklist. So I'm not going to give you a checklist. What I'm going to give you are some things to consider when you are approaching revision. And a caveat here, we are scratching the surface. We're talking broad concepts here. You should be able to draw some specific actionable items from them though, because one of my goals on this channel is not to give you fish, but to teach you how to fish. And again, every script is different. You have to know which tool to use when, and that takes time or focused learning. Things to consider when revising your script. Consideration number 1. You need to always move from big picture to small picture, from large to tiny. If your initial revision passes are focused on fixing grammar and lines of dialogue, okay, you're starting at the tiny. That's not the right way to approach it. You want to make sure that the big things are working first and then start drilling down. So here's a rough list. I'm not listing everything. This is not exhaustive, but this should give you a good idea of where things land. One of the broader things at the top of the funnel, story. I mean, the story must be working. Stories about someone who wants something badly, they're having trouble getting it, and they get it or they don't. And if anyone reads your script and they can't fill in those blanks of that, they can't tell you who the someone is, they can't tell you what they're after, they can't tell you what difficulty they had along the way, and they can't tell you whether they got it or not, if they can't do that, you're already done. You've got bigger problems than grammar. So you got to make sure your story is working. Start big. Then you start drilling down. Your main character, your protagonist. Whether they have a big, small, or a small arc, the protagonist needs some bit of arc, and it has to be evident in the story. Are all of those character beats there for the main character? Is everything there that needs to be there? And if not, you got to make sure it's there. Your antagonist, same thing. But the antagonist is a supporting character. An important one, yes, but a supporting character nonetheless. Make sure their arc, if any, is moving and consistent, as well as those of other supporting characters. Make sure all their story beats are there and that they're clear. So now you're talking like subplots and other things that are happening. You got to make sure everything is all working. You want to make sure your sequences are working. Sequences are groupings of scenes that help you tell the story. Now, I did a video about sequences, which I'll link here, but make sure your sequences are clear and intact throughout the story. Notice we're getting smaller. Now we're talking about scenes. Identify the important character and story beats in each scene and determine if those beats can be in another scene. Can you combine them with something else? Can I take the scene and combine it? Can I move it? Should I delete the scene? If I can't delete it, that's fine. If I can't move it, that's fine. But I want to make sure each scene is clear, has adequate conflict, implies future scenes, all the stuff that scenes are supposed to be doing. Everything has to be stitched together and working together. Now I've kind of got my structure. Everything's kind of working. Now I really want to start focusing on the storytelling. And this is about the audience's experience engaging with your story. Are they feeling what they're supposed to feel at the moment you want them to feel those things? And this impacts the order of things. So you know you've got everything you need now. Okay, you know you've got it all. But maybe the order isn't right. Now it's a matter of how the audience is experiencing it. So now we're starting to move things around. And now we're starting to go even a little more micro. We're starting to choose words. We're starting to really tweak our action description, our words of dialogue, all those little things. Now we're kind of at the bottom. Now, on this list, anything from the story through the scenes that gets changed, okay, this is the bigger stuff that's going to impact large swaths of your story. The smaller you get, the less it's going to impact. So sequences, that's going to be a big chunk of your story. That's going to change things. That might result in a new draft, which is going to cause you to have to work back through the process. You start back big, make sure all the story's working, and you keep going down. So the bigger the element, the more it's going to impact your story. But if you know the bigger parts are working, so the stuff at the top, if you know that's all working, now you can focus on the specifics of telling the story. Consideration number 2 when revising is this. The more detailed and bulletproof your outline, the faster you're going to move through revisions. The outline is there to make sure that the story beats are working, that the character beats are working, that you have all the pieces you need. Outlines can also help you figure out pacing and emotional turns for the characters and for the audience, depending on what outlining methods you're using. And in this sense, the more you're pre-writing, which is what outlining is part of, it's part of pre-writing, the more solid your story tends to be. And the story has to do with the bigger stuff in the revision process. And what usually happens, though, is the storytelling is what needs tweaking. So you've outlined it a lot. The more outlining you do, your story is good. The less you got to worry about the story and the character beats, but the more you've got to worry about the audience's experience. Conversely, the less you outline, the more you just kind of jump into writing your script, the more your storytelling is going to be okay, but the less likely your story and character beats and what you need them to be are going to be where they need to be. But here's the problem. If you change the story, so I just kind of like script it, I just kind of jump in, I start writing, my storytelling is good, but my story isn't really working, so I've got to change the story. Well, by changing the story, I'm going to have to rework the storytelling anyway. And this is why I'm a huge fan of making better outlines. It reduces the amount of time you have to spend revising because the big picture things usually get taken care of. Consideration number 3. Give yourself as much time as you can between drafts. Okay, so you've got a draft, you've made a change, you kind of restructured it, and now you're gonna start revising it. So give yourself as much time from when you finish that draft until you start revising it. Because one of the difficult things in screenwriting is you spend so much time with your draft and all of your drafts that they all kind of start to bleed together. And you can't really remember, hey, is this the version where she gets the job or is this the version where she gets fired from the job? And so the more time you can give yourself between drafts, that's going to help you approach your script with fresher eyes and going to make the revision process a little better. This is actually one reason why I prefer working on multiple scripts at once. Now, they're usually at different stages in the writing process. So one of them ideally being in revision and another ideally being in the planning stages. Because when I get to drafting, when I'm writing drafts, I just work exclusively on that one draft. If I'm like writing pages, I'm just doing that one draft. But when I get to the end, so finish a draft, now I work on the other story just to give myself a little bit of a break, to help me forget the one I just drafted. And then when I start revising it, I can go back to it with fresh eyes. Sometimes though, you might be on a deadline and you just don't have that much time and you've got to keep plugging through. So what you want to do is still try to give yourself as much time as you can. A week, if possible, is good. Okay, just do something else for that week. Watch a bunch of movies, read a book, anything to help clear your head. The more time and space you can give yourself, the better it's going to be when you reapproach your draft for a revision. Consideration number 4. You can't trust yourself. Now, at some point in the revision process, you're going to need some other eyeballs on your script. Now, maybe you're part of a writing group, and this is a good solution. Maybe you've taken it as far as you or your writing group can take it, but you still feel like something isn't working. Well, at that point, maybe you start to consider script coverage or script consulting services. But whatever you do, you don't send it out into the wild until a few others have looked at it. Preferably people who know the difference between a good script and a great script. And even if you have an agent, okay, this is not the time to send it to an agent. Once those you know have vetted it, okay, now send it to an agent. Now send it to a manager. Now send it to whomever, but not until other people have looked at it. The reason is, as you become proficient at screenwriting, okay, your story senses start to get really good. You start to identify story and character problems. You start to do that pretty quickly. But at a certain point, every writer goes through a phase where you start having some blind spots in regard to the audience's experience with the story. You think they're going to respond one way, but they don't. And this is why you need other people reading your stuff. Seeing how they respond is invaluable to honing your storytelling skills, because you will begin to learn what is and isn't working. So at some point in the revision process, usually once you make through all of your passes, you've got it through, you even done a polish pass, you're like, okay, this is pretty good. You're satisfied with the story, the character beats, everything's working. You feel like the storytelling's where you want it to be. Everything's polished. It's pretty. It's all good to go. Okay, now it's time for other people to read it. People are going to give you honest feedback. And then what you do is you take their notes and you start the revision process all over again. Now, I've had some scripts that have gone through round after round after round of drafts and input from producers and others interested in scripts that I've written. And I've also had some scripts that didn't get many notes at all. I mean, literally the last script I submitted to an agent, I got back 2 notes. 2. One was a dialogue line addition. They just wanted this little element to be very clear, so they wanted a line of dialogue added in. Another was the name of a character they didn't really like, and they wanted me to change the name of a character. I have no idea why, they just didn't like it for whatever reason. That was it. Those were the 2 notes I got. So notes can range from a whole lot to just a little. But at some point, others have to start looking at it. You can't trust yourself. Consideration number 5, the last one I'm going to give you. Hold on to the reason you love the story in the first place. Whether your story goes through a lot of changes or a few, there is a reason you are drawn to tell that story in the first place. It's the thing that connects you to it. It's the reason you wanted to tell that story. Several years ago, I wrote a monster type story kind of in the vein of Jurassic Park meets Planet of the Apes. And there was a lot of craziness in that story that happens. But at the core of the story is a dad trying to rescue his daughter. Now, I have 3 daughters. Now, the oldest one right now is in college, but I wrote it when all 3 of my girls were little. And every parent's nightmare of their kid being taken or lost or something the parent can't do to prevent. And what that parent would do to get their child back. That story, yes, it has monsters. The story I wrote, there's lots of monsters. There's lots of stuff that goes on. And I never cared, though, how much the monsters changed or how I had to change the story beats or any of that. But one thing that was never going away was a dad trying to get his daughter back. So before you revise a single word of any draft, make sure you know what your story is about. Make sure you know why it matters to you. Make sure you know why you feel so strongly about it. Because you're going to probably spend a lot more time with that story, and you need to love it at its core. And the way you can keep doing it, no matter what needs to change, is you absolutely must keep in the story what you love about the story. Again, we are scratching the surface here when it comes to revision. But if you want to transform yourself into a screenwriter who can masterfully tell stories that matter, where your screenwriting is such that you know how to handle every bit of the writing process, from generating ideas that's going to garner interest to executing those ideas through the revision process, and you want to join a growing community of other like-minded screenwriters, book a free call with me to apply for the Screenplay Navigator. It will radically transform you as a writer, and if you're serious about the craft, it has the potential to radically change your life. Click link below to learn more and to book a call. Hopefully this has been helpful to you. And if it has, please be sure to like, subscribe, bell, all that stuff. I really, really do appreciate it. There are links below, again, that you might find helpful. Be sure to check all those out. And when you go to tell a story, no matter how many times you have to revise it to get it where you need to be, make sure you tell a story that matters. See you later.